January 2026. The dust was still settling on the streets of Caracas. For the first time in 25 years, U.S. military Humvees were parked outside the Miraflores Palace. The images were broadcast live to every corner of the globe. They showed American soldiers shaking hands with liberated citizens. They showed the statues of the old regime being pulled down, reminiscent of Baghdad in 2003. Headlines across the Western world screamed victory with a fervor we haven't seen in decades. The tyrant has fallen. Democracy returns to South America. A new era for Venezuela. And perhaps the most important headline. The one whispered in the boardrooms of Houston, London, and New York. The oil is finally open for business. It seemed like the perfect Hollywood ending to a long, messy chapter of history. Donald Trump, in his signature style, stood before the cameras in Washington. He declared a total, absolute win. He told the American people that the operation was a masterstroke of strategy. He promised that Venezuelan crude, the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, would soon flood American refineries. He promised that the revenue from this oil would not only pay for the intervention, but would lower gas prices for every American family. It was presented as a simple transaction. It's a simple equation. Remove the dictator, take the oil. Profit. But while Washington was popping champagne and planning victory parades, something else was happening in the shadows. Something that the cameras didn't see. Something that the military strategists in the Pentagon had overlooked. 4,000 miles away, in the freezing cold of Moscow, there was no panic. There was no scramble to burn documents. There was no emergency evacuation of Russian personnel from Venezuela. Instead, the mood in the Kremlin was icy calm. On January 13th, just 48 hours after the fall of Caracas, a single document was quietly released. It didn't come from a military general threatening nuclear war. It didn't come from a diplomat issuing a formal protest. It came from an entity that 99% of Americans have never heard of. An entity named Roszarubezhneft. The statement was short. It was cold. And it was legally bulletproof. It read, "All energy assets currently operated by Russian entities in Venezuela are the property of the Russian state. Any attempt to seize, reorganize, or interfere with these assets will be considered a direct violation of Russian sovereignty." Read that again. Let those words sink in. Not a violation of a commercial contract, not a business dispute. A violation of sovereignty. In that precise moment, the trap snapped shut. The U.S. military had captured the palace. Yes. They controlled the streets. Yes. But Vladimir Putin had already changed the locks on the vault. This video is not about who won the battle for Caracas. It is not about the tanks, the drones, or the soldiers. It is about why the United States cannot touch the prize it came for. We are going to decode the sovereign shield. A brilliant, complex, legal, and strategic mechanism built over 5 years for this exact moment. We will explain why the most powerful oil companies in the world, ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, are terrified to step foot in the country. Even with the U.S. Army guarding the gates, the ghost entity. To understand the magnitude of this trap, we have to travel back in time. We have to go back to March 2020. The world was distracted by the global pandemic. But in the energy markets, a different crisis was brewing. The United States had just slapped massive, crippling sanctions on Rosneft trading. Rosneft is the Russian oil giant, run by Igor Sechin, a man often called the Darth Vader of Russia due to his ruthless efficiency and closeness to Putin. The sanctions were hurting. They were cutting off Rosneft's ability to trade globally, threatening their operations in Europe and Asia. Washington thought they had Russia cornered. They thought Russia would be forced to abandon Venezuela to save its own company, and for a moment, it looked like they were right. On March 28, 2020, Russia made a surprise announcement that shocked the energy world. Rosneft was leaving Venezuela. Completely, they announced they were selling all their assets in the country. Every oil field, every pipeline, every share in the joint ventures. The Western media laughed. Opinion columns in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal called it a retreat. They said U.S. sanctions had worked perfectly. They said Russia was cutting its losses and running away, leaving Maduro alone. But they were wrong, dead wrong. They were looking at the surface, while the real game was happening underneath. Russia didn't sell those assets to a third party. They didn't sell them to China. They didn't sell them to private investors in Dubai or India. They transferred them to a newly created company. A company that didn't exist just weeks before. A company with no website, no public phone number, no press office, no board of directors listed on any stock exchange in London or New York. That company was Roszarubezhneft. Journalists tried to find its headquarters. They tried to find who was running it. They found nothing but a registered address in Moscow, shared with dozens of other government bureaus. And here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The detail that explains everything happening today. Who owns Roszarubezhneft? It is not owned by shareholders. It is not owned by oligarchs. It is 100% owned by the Federal Agency for State Property Management. In Russian, it is known as Roszarubezhneft. This means Roszarubezhneft is not a commercial company in the traditional sense. It is a direct arm of the Russian federal government. It is as much a part of the Russian state as the Ministry of Defense or the central bank. Why does this matter? Why go through all this trouble to create a ghost company? Because in international law, there is a massive detrimental difference between a company and a state. If the U.S. government seizes assets from a private company like Rosneft, it is a lawsuit. It is a trade dispute. Lawyers get involved, settlements are made, fines are paid. It is business. But if the U.S. government seizes assets that belong directly to a sovereign state, that is an act of war. By moving everything to Roszarubezhneft, Putin was not retreating. He was upgrading his defense. He was taking commercial oil fields and turning them into sovereign Russian territory. Imagine if the NYPD tried to seize the French embassy in Manhattan because France owed money to a U.S. bank. They can't. It is protected soil. It is sovereign territory. That is exactly what Putin did to the oil fields in the Orinoco Belt. He gave them diplomatic immunity. The sovereign shield mechanism. Let's dig deeper into how this shield actually works on the ground. Because this is the part that is keeping U.S. strategists awake at night in the Situation Room. The Venezuelan oil industry is not a free-for-all. It operates through a specific legal structure called joint ventures, or JVs. This means no foreign company owns an oil field 100%. They own it in partnership with PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company. Usually, the split is 60% for Venezuela, 40% for the partner, or sometimes 51 to 49. But they are partners. They share the infrastructure. They share the pipes. They share the export terminals. So, visualize a pipeline running from the heavy oil belt to the coast. The thick black crude flowing through that pipe is a mix. Part of it belongs to Venezuela. Part of it belongs to Russia. Physically, you cannot separate them. You cannot filter out the Russian molecules from the Venezuelan molecules. Now, imagine the new U.S.-backed government in Caracas wants to sell that oil too. Refineries in Texas, they want to start generating cash. They can't, because if they sell a tanker of that crude, they are selling stolen Russian state property. This creates a legal toxicity that is almost impossible to clean. Let's look at the case of Citgo for a comparison, because people often get confused here. Citgo was a Venezuelan-owned company, but it was incorporated in the United States. It operated on U.S. soil. Therefore, U.S. courts could seize it. It was subject to commercial law and U.S. jurisdiction, but Roszarubezhneft has sovereign immunity. This is a principle in international law, principle the U.S. itself relies on heavily, that says one state cannot judge the actions of another state in its own courts. If the U.S. tries to expropriate these Russian shares, or if they try to sell the oil without Russia's permission, Moscow doesn't just sue for damages. they retaliate. They have the legal right to seize U.S. assets in Russia. They can seize U.S. assets in friendly jurisdictions. They can argue at the UN and the World Court that the U.S. has broken the fundamental rules of the global order. This is why the statement from Moscow was so confident, so arrogant. They know the U.S. legal system better than the U.S. public does. They know that American oil companies cannot operate in a legal gray zone. Chevron cannot invest billions of dollars into a field if the ownership is contested by a nuclear superpower. Think about the CEO of Chevron. He has to answer to shareholders. He has to answer to a board. He cannot risk billions of dollars on a project that could be frozen by a court order in London or Singapore the next day. It is simply too risky. Insurers would refuse to cover the projects. Banks would refuse to lend the money. So, what you have is a zombie oil industry. The U.S. controls the ground. They control the ports. But the legal structure is dead. It is frozen in a block of Russian ice. The oil is there, waiting. But nobody dares to touch it. The 15-year lock. But the trap gets even worse. It is not just about ownership. It is about time. The Russian strategy wasn't just to buy the assets. It was to lock them down for a generation. Just 2 months before the fall of Maduro, in November 2025, a critical, underreported event took place in Caracas. While the world was focused on the troop buildups and the threats of invasion, the Venezuelan National Assembly held a quiet session. There was no fanfare. No international press. But in that session, they approved a massive extension of the joint venture contracts with Russia. They didn't extend them for 1 year or 2 years. They extended them for 15 years. The new contracts are valid until 2041. Think about that date. That is for U.S. presidential elections away. That is an eternity in politics. Why did they do this right before the end of the regime? Because it is a classic poison pill. Any new government that comes into power in Venezuela has a choice. Choice A. They respect the contracts. This means Russia keeps making money for the next 15 years. Russia keeps its influence. Russia keeps its intelligence agents embedded in the energy sector. Basically, the U.S. occupies the country, but Russia profits from the resources. Or choice B. They tear up the contracts. This sounds easy, right? Just say the old government was illegitimate and canceled the deal. But if they do that, they declare Venezuela a rogue state that doesn't honor its signature on international treaties. That scares away every other investor in the world. If you are a European company, or an Indian company, or a Brazilian company looking at Venezuela, and you see the new government ripping up legal contracts signed by the sovereign state just because, they do unlike the partner. You do not invest, because you know you could be next. You know that your contract is only as good as the current president's mood. So the U.S. is stuck in a lose-lose situation. If they honor the deal, Putin wins. If they cancel the deal, they destroy Venezuela's economy before it even starts to rebuild. This helps explain the deafening silence of the big oil majors. ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips. These companies have been waiting for 20 years to get back into Venezuela. They know the geology better than anyone. You would expect them to be announcing big plans. You would expect press releases about returning to help the Venezuelan people. But they are silent, not a peep. Why? Because they have teams of expensive lawyers reading these Roszarubezhneft contracts. And they are seeing the same thing we are seeing, a minefield. They know that if they start pumping oil from a Russian-claimed field, Russia will unleash lawfare on a global scale. Russia will sue them in London, in Singapore, in The Hague. They will chase every cargo of oil that leaves a Venezuelan port. They will file motions to impound ships in international waters. It would be a legal nightmare that could last for decades. And for what? For heavy crude that is expensive to refine and difficult to transport. In a world where energy transition is accelerating, Is it worth a 20-year legal war with Russia? The answer from Houston is a resounding no. The checkmate. So where does this leave us? Let's look at the board. Donald Trump promised a quick, decisive victory. He sold the intervention as a business deal. He promised a treasure chest of oil to pay for the operation. Instead, he has found a locked vault, and the keys are in Moscow. This is the harsh reality of modern warfare in the 21st century. It is not just about who has the best tanks or the most drones. It is about lawfare. It is about using corporate structures, sovereign debt, and international law as weapons. Putin saw this coming 5 years ago. He knew Maduro might fall. He knew the U.S. military was superior. So he didn't try to build a military fortress in Venezuela. He built a legal fortress. He built a structure that could survive the regime change. He built a structure that doesn't depend on who sits in the presidential palace in Caracas. It depends on the immutability of state sovereignty. The U.S. is now occupying a country that it cannot afford to fix. Because the revenue stream needed to fix it, the oil's legally blocked. It is a gridlock, a geopolitical stalemate. Trump can bluster on television. He can threaten sanctions. He can talk about buying Greenland or Iceland to distract the media cycle. But the reality on the ground in Venezuela is cold, hard, and expensive. The oil is there. You can smell it. But it might as well be on the moon. Because until Russia agrees to unlock it, it stays in the ground, or it flows only on Russia's terms. This leads us to a terrifying question about what happens next. If the U.S. decides to break the glass, if they decide that they don't care about international law, if they seize the Russian assets anyway, what is the cost? Does Russia seize U.S. assets in Europe in retaliation? Does Russia seize Western assets in the Arctic? If sovereign immunity no longer exists, then no asset is safe anywhere in the world. We are looking at the potential collapse of the global economic rulebook. All because of a few oil fields in the Orinoco Belt. Is it worth it? That is the question Trump has to answer. As we watch this drama unfold, we must realize one thing. The era of easy regime change is over. The idea that you can just topple a government and inherit its wealth is a fantasy from the 20th century. In the 21st century, the world is too interconnected, too legally bound, too complex. While Russia has used the legal shield to block the U.S., there is another player who has used a financial shield, a player who holds billions of dollars of Venezuelan debt, and who has been very, very quiet throughout this entire crisis. China, Beijing, has its own trap set in Venezuela. And in many ways, it is even more deadly than the Russian one. But that is a story for another time. What do you think? Will Trump risk a total breakdown of international law to get the oil? Key. Or will he be forced to sit down and make a humiliating deal with Putin? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to understand the other half of this trap, make sure you are subscribed. In the next video, we are going to expose the Beijing Protocol. How China is silently waiting to collect its debt from the US-backed government. You do not want to miss that. Thanks for watching.